All right, so in this lesson, we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations by factoring special cases. In the last lesson, we discussed factoring special cases, so let's just go ahead and jump right into solving these equations. So the way you can determine whether or not you have a special case is to look at the first term and the third term. And if they're both perfect squares, then you probably have a special case. So for example here, 4x squared, that's a perfect square. 4 comes from 2 times 2, and x squared comes from x times x. 9 is a perfect square. It comes from 3 times 3. So now, since all three terms are positive, what that tells me is I most probably have an a plus b squared case. So let's go ahead and take a look. So what's the square root of 4x squared? That's going to be 2x. And what's the square root of 9? That's going to be 3. And since everything is positive, it's going to be 2x plus 3 squared equals 0. Let's go ahead and work that out just to make sure we got that right. In an a plus b squared, we have a squared in the front, so 2x times 2x, that's 4x squared. In the back, we have b squared, so 3 times 3 is 9. In the middle, 2 times a times b. So 2x times 3 is 6x times 2 is 12x, and that gives us what we want. So we know this is correct. So since we have 2x plus 3 squared, which is 2x plus 3 times 2x plus 3 equals 0, and we have to solve set to 0, we really just end up with one equation. And that equation is 2x plus 3 equals 0. And in order to solve, we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. And we end up with 2x equals negative 3. And then finally, just divide both sides by 2. We got x equals negative 3 over 2, or negative 1 and a half. All right, let's take a look at our next example. If you think you get it, pause it and try to solve it on your own. So, is x squared a perfect square? Yes. Is 64 a perfect square? Yes. My middle term is negative. What does this tell me? That it most probably is an a minus b squared. So, where does x squared come from? What's the square root of x squared? X. What's the square root of 64? 8. And since my middle term is negative, it's going to be x minus 8 squared equals 0. I'm not going to FOIL it out. If you're not sure, go ahead and try it yourself. But we got x minus 8 squared equals 0. And again, since both of the binomials are x minus 8, we end up with just one equation. And that one equation is x minus 8 equals 0. And to solve, all we got to do is add 8 to both sides. And we get as our solution x equals 8. All right, a few more examples. This next one here, 25x squared minus 1 equals 0. So, what do you notice in this one? Well, 25x squared, is that a perfect square? Yes. Is 1 a perfect square? Yes, it comes from 1 times 1. But notice there's no middle term. So what this tells me is the special case this comes from is an a plus b times a minus b. So let's take a look. So what is the square root of 25x squared? And that's going to be 5x, because 5 times 5 is 25, and x times x is x squared. And what's the square root of 1? And that's going to be 1. And since there's no middle term, we know that this is going to be a 5x plus 1 times a 5x minus 1. And that equals 0. Okay, so now in this case, we do have two different binomials because one is plus 1 and the other one is minus 1. So we have now two equations to work out. So we have 5x plus 1 equals 0, and we have 5x minus 1 equals 0. All right, so then here, I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides, and I get 5x equals negative 1. And then when I divide both sides by 5, I get x equals negative 1/5. The other side, I'm going to add 1 to both sides. And I get 5x equals 1. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 5, and I get x equals positive 1/5. And that's our answer. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at this next example here. All right, so we have here 25x squared minus 10x plus 1 equals 0. If you think you got this, go ahead and try it on your own. Is 25x squared a perfect square? Yeah, we already know from here it is. And is 1 a perfect square? Yes, again, we already know from here it is. And my middle term is negative. So what does that tell me? That it's going to be an a minus b squared situation. So the square root of 25x squared, we already know, is 5x. And the square root of 1 is 1. And since the middle term is negative, it's going to be 5x minus 1 squared equals 0. So again, since both binomials are the same, we only have one equation to work out. We get 5x minus 1 equals 0. And if we look here at this example, we can see it's going to be the same answer. So we get x equals positive 1/5. All right, next example. We have here 8x to the 4th minus 2x squared equals 0. Now, in this case, I look at 8x to the 4th and I see that 8 is not a perfect square. And neither is 2. But what I do notice is that 8 and 2 can both be divided by 2. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's factor out a 2. And factor out a 2 and an x squared. So if I factor out a 2x squared here, so what is 8x to the 4th divided by 2x squared? And that's going to be 4x squared. And what is negative 2x squared divided by 2x squared? And that's going to be negative 1. So here now you see I have 2x squared times 4x squared minus 1 equals 0. Okay? And now I can take this 4x squared minus 1 and factor it as a special case, because 4x squared is a perfect square and so is 1. So I have here my 2x squared times. Now notice, perfect square in the front, perfect square in the back, no middle term. This is an a plus b times a minus b. So 2x squared times the square root of 4x squared is going to be 2x, and the square root of 1 is going to be 1. And since there's no middle term, it's going to be a 2x plus 1 times 2x minus 1, and that equals 0. So we have here two binomials, and we set them equal to 0. So I have here 2x plus 1 equals 0, and 2x minus 1 equals 0. Over here, I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. I get 2x equals negative 1. And when I divide by 2, I get x equals negative half. On this side, I'm going to add 1 to both sides. And I get 2x equals positive 1. And when I divide by 2, I get x equals 1/2. All right, let's take a look at some word problem examples. Here we are. All right. So it says here, as a satellite falls from outer space onto Mars, its distance in miles from the planet is given by the formula d equals negative 9t squared plus 776, where t is the number of hours it has fallen. Find when the satellite will be 200 miles away from Mars. So if the satellite's going to be 200 miles away from Mars, that's going to be d. So we need to solve for that, right? So I'm going to write this in the other order. So I'm going to put here negative 9t squared plus 776 equals, and instead of d, I'm going to write 200. Okay? So now, what do I have to do here? Well, I need to set this equal to 0, right? So I need to subtract 200 from both sides. And this gives me here negative 9t squared plus 576 equals 0. Okay, next thing. Remember we talked about in a previous lesson, we don't want our a value to be negative. So let's go ahead and factor out this negative 1. So I'm going to say, okay, negative 1. Okay, and negative 9t squared divided by negative 1 is positive 9t squared. And 576 divided by negative 1 is negative 576. Okay, and I can see 9t squared, that's a perfect square. 576, that's a perfect square. And there's no middle term, so this is an a plus b times a minus b situation. So we have here negative 1 times, okay, what is the square root of 9t squared? And that's going to be 3t. And the square root of 576 is 24. 24. And again, since the middle term, since this is negative and there's no middle term, it's going to be 3t plus 24 times 3t minus 24 equals 0. And we have two binomials, so we're going to set both of these equations equal to 0. So we have here 3t plus 24 equals 0, and 3t minus 24 equals 0. Over here, I'm going to subtract 24 from both sides. And I'm going to get 3t equals negative 24. And if I look ahead, negative 24 divided by 3 is going to be a negative number. Again, can we measure time in negative numbers? We can't. So we know this answer is not going to make sense. So let's do the next problem. So we're going to add 24 here to both sides. We get 3t equals 24. And when we divide by 3, we get t equals 8. So it takes 8 hours, okay, for the satellite to be 200 miles away from Mars. All right? Okay. So our last example here. Let's take a look. The height of a model rocket is given in centimeters by the formula h equals negative 490t squared, where t is measured in seconds, and h equals 0 refers to its original height at the top of the mountain. It begins to fly down from the mountaintop at time t equals 0. When has the rocket descended 490 centimeters? So again, I'm going to flip this around, and I'm going to put negative 490 t squared in the front equals h, and I want to know when has it descended 490 centimeters. That means when has it decreased 490. So that's going to be when is negative 490 t squared equal to negative 490. So again, our first thing is to set this equal to 0. So we're going to add 490 to both sides, and we get negative 490 t squared plus 490 equals 0. Again, I don't want my a value to be negative. And I also notice that both of these end in 0. So let's go ahead and factor this by factoring out a negative 10. So if I divide everything here by negative 10, okay, I get negative 490 t squared divided by negative 10 is going to be positive 49 t squared. And positive 490 divided by negative 10 is going to be negative 49. And that equals 0. Now, if you're saying, Mr. Sedano, you've told us that you can't do something to one side of an equation. All right, so if you're worried about that, what is 0 divided by negative 10? Still 0. So this works out perfectly, okay? So again, I see 49t squared comes from a perfect square, and 49 is a perfect square. And since there's no middle term, this is an a plus b times a minus b situation. So let's go ahead and factor this. So we have here negative 10 times. What's the square root of 49t squared? That's going to be 7t. And the square root of 49 is 7. And since there's no middle term, it's going to be 7t plus 7 times 7t minus 7 equals 0. Again, since there's two binomials, I'm going to set each one separately equal to 0. Let me do that up here. So we're going to go 7t plus 7 equals 0 and 7t minus 7 equals 0. Let's solve these. Here I'm going to subtract 7 from both sides, and I get 7t equals negative 7. And when I divide by 7, I get t equals negative 1. I know that answer can't make sense because, again, we cannot measure time in negative units. So let's go ahead and solve the next one. This time I'm going to add 7 to both sides, and I get 7t equals 7. And when I divide both sides by 7, this time I get t equals positive 1. So when has the rocket descended 490 centimeters? After 1 second, because in this case t equals number of seconds.